All right, hi. So I'm actually Joanna Sollins. I'm going to be starting off this joint talk with my lab mate Alex Webster on work we've been doing with our advisor Mary Cadenasso right here at UC Davis. So Alex and I have been studying similar systems for our graduate work, and as we're coming close to the ends of our dissertations, we found there's a lot of common threads in our research. So we wanted to take this opportunity to try to weave those together for you and share our perspectives on small streams and riparian zones in the Sacramento Valley. And I just wanted to put in a note, thank you very much for staying to the end. We actually switched time slots because as a joint talk we needed a little bit more time for this, so just prepare yourselves for a slightly longer story arc, and sorry to impinge on the break a little bit. So both Alex and I are doing our research on riparian zones along small waterways in the Sacramento region of the Central Valley, and specifically in this region spanning the basin outlined in red. And this is a map of the historical vegetation of the region, showing that it once supported a lush assemblage of grasslands, oak woodlands, wetlands, and riparian forests, which you can see as these dark green bands along the major waterways. What this coarse scale map doesn't show are the small streams that once permeated the landscape between these major gallery forests and provided an extensive network of stream, riparian, and wetland habitat. And these streams are the equivalent of what Alex and I study today, and once may have looked something like this. However, this is not a photograph from our study region because no pristine extents of small lowland streams exist in the Central Valley today. And this is because, like is true throughout the world, riparian and stream ecosystems in this area have been heavily impacted by land conversion to agricultural and urban uses, as you can see by this modern imagery of the same region. And the Central Valley represents a somewhat extreme version of both of these pressures. It's both one of the most productive agricultural systems in the world and also home to 6.5 million people and is the most rapidly urbanizing area in the state. So small streams in both land uses have been modified. In the agricultural land use, they've often been straightened, consolidated, and rerouted to serve as infrastructure to convey drainage and irrigation water. And in the urban system, they've often been simplified and incised due to their use for stormwater conveyance. And today, there's arguably no small stream in the Central Valley that hasn't been impacted by one of these land uses. And Alex and I focus our research on understanding the riparian zones along these small waterways. Alex's research takes place in the intensive agricultural landscape to the west of the Sacramento River, which runs north to south here through the valley, and includes a total of 79 stream reaches. And just to give you some context, we are right here in Davis. And then my research takes place in the dense suburbs of Sacramento and includes 69 stream reaches. And our research centers around understanding the plant-soil-water interactions in these systems and how they might affect the ecosystem services that these areas provide. We're going to focus on 3 ecosystem services, specifically habitat, water quality, which clearly affects aquatic habitat, and carbon storage. And we really want to understand what influences the provision of these services and how we can manage riparian zones to increase them. So to give you a preview of how we're going to go through our research, we're going to start with the plant community, and I'll be talking about some work I did in the urban system looking at riparian canopy cover. And then we're going to move on to a collaborative project we've been working on to compare riparian ground layer vegetation in both systems, as well as their soil organic matter. And then Alex is going to present some of the research she did in the agricultural landscape, tying denitrification potential to in-stream nitrate uptake. We'll show that both systems experience dry season water subsidies, and then I'll conclude by tying that back to present-day trees in urban riparian zones. So to begin, we'll take a historical look at riparian vegetation change in this area, specifically focusing on riparian canopy cover. So riparian canopy cover affects both aquatic ecosystems and riparian understories by influencing light availability and organic matter inputs. And I chose the Arcade Creek watershed as a case study to track changes in riparian tree canopy with land conversion from agriculture to urban development. And Arcade Creek is a small tributary of the Sacramento River, and its watershed encompasses about 85 square kilometers of the Sacramento metropolitan area. So I looked at changes in land cover and riparian forest using aerial imagery of the watershed from 1937, 1984, and 2014. I mapped land cover for each time period and also measured the extent of riparian tree canopy across the entire stream network. And as you can see, the watershed has transitioned from almost entirely agricultural land covers of pasture and crops to almost entirely urban development by 2014. And this change in land use has been accompanied by a steady and dramatic increase in the amount of tree canopy along streams. So this graph shows the mean width of tree canopy across the stream network for each time period, and it nearly doubles between 1937 and 2014. And I investigated a number of different drivers of this change, and I don't have time to go into that, but I ultimately concluded that a release from agricultural pressures was largely responsible for this increase in canopy cover. So agricultural riparian areas would have been heavily managed or grazed, whereas urban riparian areas in this area of Sacramento tend to be relatively abandoned as flood zones, allowing trees to regenerate. And streams that are still in the agricultural land use don't show this increase in canopy. So for example, this is one of Alex's stream reaches, and you can see in 1937 and 2014, despite the fact that the type of agriculture has clearly evolved and the stream channel has been modified, the amount of canopy cover has remained relatively constant at basically zero. And despite the fact that we haven't done an extensive historical analysis of riparian canopy in the agricultural land use, we do have evidence that today there tends to be much more in the urban landscape. So these are histograms showing canopy cover data that we collected in our study sites in 2014, and as you can see, the agricultural sites show an extremely skewed distribution towards zero, whereas the urban sites are more evenly distributed and tend to be clustered in the higher cover classes. And now Alex is going to expand on the work that we're doing to compare the riparian zones in these two land uses.
Hi. So I'm Alex Webster, and I'm going to be bringing us from the riparian canopy into the riparian ground layer, and from a historic perspective all the way into modern conditions. So this is a project that we did to compare systems across the land uses, and we sampled 40 small low gradient streams in each land use for a total of 80 sites. We focused specifically on the stream margin ground layer. This is the band of vegetation that marks the transition between the channel and the bank, and particularly in semi-arid climates like ours, where summer water availability limits plant growth, it's thought to be a really important zone for seedling recruitment, bank stability, nutrient cycling, and the maintenance of regional biodiversity. It was also a really good basis of comparison across all of our study sites, since so many of them, as Joanna mentioned, lack woody overstories. And given that there's arguably no reference condition for small Central Valley streams, and that the vast majority of them exist in one of these two land uses, our objectives were just to get a basic understanding of the composition of this community and to compare it across the two land uses. And we also wanted to assess what factors were shaping the vegetation communities both within and across land uses. So what did we find? I'm going to start with what was similar about the vegetation across the two land uses. So all these major cover metrics were not significantly different. So stream margin vegetation on urban and agricultural streams had similar levels of total living vegetation cover, native cover, noxious weed cover, diversity in both the whole community and just the native portion of the community, and similar wetland prevalence indices, which is a measure of the wetland affiliation of the vegetation. So this gave us a pretty good basis of comparison going forward. However, despite all of these differences, the communities were in fact different overall. So this is an NMDS plot where each of the dots is one of our 80 sites colored by land use, and and plotted according to their vegetation community similarity. And though there's some overlap in the two clusters, the clusters clearly separate out, so that reflects a difference in the total composition of the community. And we were interested in what actual species were driving these patterns. So we quantitatively identified our generalist species versus the unique indicator species for each land use using indicator species analysis. And our generalist species are those that are randomly distributed across the land uses and are therefore maintaining similarity between them. And we found that our generalist species were all native wetland species like willows and fringed willow herb, whereas our unique indicator species were mostly mostly exotic species, and not only exotic species, but noxious weed species. And I'll hit on these guys again in a moment, but that gives you some of our key findings about what's composing these communities and how they differ across the land uses. And next, what factors are shaping these similarities and differences. So I'll be focusing on just three of the most important factors we looked at today: canopy cover, bank height, and bank slope. And first, canopy cover, which as a reminder, we know is generally greater in the riparian canopy on urban streams due to their histories of land conversion. And the traits of our indicator species really reflect this. Those agricultural noxious weeds are all grasses and forbs that are completely intolerant of shading when establishing, whereas those urban indicator species are a perennial shrub and tree that are either tolerant of shading or actually prefer shade. And how, more broadly, might the canopy cover be shaping the community? In urban, where there was a wide distribution of canopy cover, we actually saw that more riparian canopy was very strongly associated with lower native cover and diversity and more noxious weeds in that stream margin. So that increase in canopy cover in general along urban streams wasn't necessarily associated with increasing the quality of the vegetation growing under it. Next, we looked at bank height, which was the distance from the channel Thalweg to the first significant change in land surface. And this was a metric of incision, which we know occurs in streams in both land uses, and we thought was likely to impact stream margin vegetation. However, it's important to keep in mind that in agricultural waterways, bank heights may vary due to intentional channel alterations and historic conditions that the current channel is rerouted from, so it may vary without being necessarily associated with higher stream power or scour. And in fact, that difference was reflected in our data. So consistent with the idea that it reflects incision, in urban streams it was associated with more bare ground and less perennial vegetation, whereas in agriculture it was really strongly associated with less bare ground, more perennial vegetation, more cover and diversity of both the native and total community, and more noxious weeds. So basically just a lot more vegetation where bank heights were higher, which was a little bit of an unexpected association, so what might explain that? We do think in urban that it mainly reflects incision. However, and we also think that that is the case in agriculture, but it's often also associated with lower management pressures. And that's because it's a lot easier for farmers to get into shallow sites like these with herbicide application equipment and big scraping application equipment versus deep sites like these. And these trends were so strong in agricultural streams, in fact, that we think that these deeper channels are one of the very few places where stream margin vegetation escapes intensive management. And finally, we looked at bank slope along the stream margin, and we were interested in this as a possible fine-scale control on water availability to that stream margin vegetation. And in fact, we found trends in both land uses that were consistent with this idea. In both urban and agricultural sites, we saw that increasing bank slope was associated with increasing the wetland prevalence, or in other words, decreasing the wetland affiliation of the vegetation. And in both urban and agricultural sites, we saw that increasing bank slope was associated with more noxious weeds. And that may be because our major noxious weed species are more upland affiliated, or because they're disturbance adapted and stable, and slopes tend to be less stable when they're steep. So to review, we see that agricultural and urban small lowland streams share a suite of common native wetland species, but have really contrasting exotic and noxious weed species. So weeds are often thought of as homogenizing elements associated with human impacts, but we're seeing here that they're actually causing a divergence in the type of riparian habitat available on these small Central Valley waterways. Second, what factors were shaping these communities? We've seen that bank slope operates similarly across the two land uses. It's associated with both the wetland affiliation and weediness of the community, while other drivers diverge across the two land uses. So in agriculture, we see a strong association of bank height with vegetation, which we think reflects that bank height provides an escape from management pressure. In urban, canopy was a more important factor. We saw that in closed canopy sites, we have low native cover and diversity and more noxious weeds, which might reflect what kind of light conditions stream margin vegetation in this region need. So that gives you an idea of some of the dynamics going on in the vegetation community, both in the overstory and the understory. And next we wanted to see how this interacts with soil organic matter, which we looked at in both systems, and how that's connected to denitrification and in-stream nitrate uptake, which I looked at just in the agricultural land use. So soil organic matter is a great way to look at plant-soil water interactions in general because it reflects the balance between things like water availability's effects on soil redox conditions, plant productivity and organic matter inputs, and geomorphic conditions like scour over time. So we again sampled this along the stream margin. And first, what we did not find was that there was more soil organic matter in one land use versus the other, or that it was associated with riparian canopy cover, both either within or across land uses. So that big increase we saw in urban canopy cover isn't associated with soil organic matter, at least in the stream margin, at least yet. And so we looked deeper within each land use, and I'm going to show you what was associated with soil organic matter oriented along this diagram of plant-soil water interactions to reflect how it may integrate some of these dynamics. And we found first that in both land uses, more soil organic matter was associated with more ground layer vegetation cover, and that more soil organic matter was associated with higher flow consistency in our sites. And as a kind of interesting integrator of those two things, more soil organic matter was associated with a higher wetland affiliation of the vegetation community. It's also important to consider the physical stability of soil and stream margins when looking at soil organic matter. And along those lines, we saw that in urban sites where we saw that bank height was an indicator possibly of incision and scour, that bank height was associated with less soil organic matter. And then we saw in agricultural sites an indirect relationship between bank slope and soil organic matter through a negative effect of bank slope on the community wetland affiliation. So besides the fact that it's a great integrator of plant-soil water interactions, we care about soil organic matter because, in part, it drives a lot of microbial processes. For example, denitrification is an often much-loved microbial process because it involves microbes turning excess nitrate, which is often considered a pollutant in these systems, into inert and to gas. And to do that, they need a carbon source, which in soil comes from soil organic matter. And we care about denitrification in riparian soils in particular because it's often considered a good indicator of how functional a riparian ecosystem is. And also it can influence water quality since it's typically the major pathway by which riparian conditions can influence the removal of excess nitrate. So for all those reasons, I did a study of this in my sites in the agricultural land use, and I worked across all 79 of my sites to do a broad survey approach of denitrification potential in riparian soils. Denitrification potential measures the maximum potential activity of denitrifying microbes in a soil sample. So it doesn't measure denitrification rates directly, but it allows you to capture a lot of landscape heterogeneity and compare a lot of samples relative to each other, which is exactly what I wanted to do. And then I also measured soil organic matter again in all of these samples, thinking that as the fuel for the microbes, that it would probably explain a lot of variation in their function. And in fact, it did. I found a very strong relationship between soil organic matter and denitrification potential here on the x-axis and y-axis. And so if we want to increase denitrification, one way we can do that is through increasing soil organic matter. And to zoom back out to the landscape and tie our two land uses back together, all these associations we identified with soil organic matter can therefore potentially go on to fuel denitrification in riparian soils. Denitrification potential doesn't matter that much, though, if you can't actually link it to removing excess nitrate in these streams. So along with investigating this, I looked at in-stream nitrate uptake. And for this, I again used a broad survey approach across all my agricultural stream reaches and sampled repeatedly at the inlet and the outlet of each stream reach. And then I asked what characteristics of the stream reach, including their average denitrification potential, were associated with a higher probability of observing nitrate loss, where nitrate loss was defined as a greater than -5% change in nitrate from the inlet to the outlet of a study reach. And in fact, we did find that the probability of observing nitrate loss here on the y-axis was associated with increasing denitrification potential in riparian soils. So this is obviously a correlation that needs more testing, but it does give us some evidence that riparian soil conditions may influence water quality, and that's the first time, to my knowledge, in this area, in these highly impacted waterways, that that kind of link has been demonstrated. And so finally, we're going to end by moving from water quality to water quantity, and from the riparian understory back into the riparian overstory. And we're going to do that by talking about dry season water subsidies, which occur in both systems, and then specifically in urban streams, how that affects trees in the riparian zone.
Thanks. So this is kind of a cool contrast to what Parsa was talking about earlier. We have a Mediterranean climate, and in the Central Valley, that means that a lot of small streams would have historically been intermittent. They would have stopped flowing during the summer dry season. However, in agricultural landscapes, stream channels are often used to convey irrigation and drainage water in the dry season. So that means that these streams are receiving varying levels of water subsidies depending on where and how much farmers are irrigating and draining their fields. In the urban system, summer stream flows are often fed by unintentional inputs from landscape irrigation, which is often affectionately called urban drool. And in both of these systems, these highly localized inputs mean that, at least in drought years when we sampled, some of these stream reaches are having perennial flows, whereas some of them are actually drying up still in the summer. And we've both found in our work that, that this is having an impact on riparian ecosystems. So for instance, Alex found in the agricultural system that flow consistency is likely affecting microbial community composition, and then I'm interested in how it impacts the plant community in the urban landscape. So when we have these summer flows, we expect that that's going to be creating wetter conditions in the riparian zone. However, as we mentioned before, urban streams are often highly incised, and that can actually create drier conditions in the riparian zone by lowering water tables, potentially below the primary rooting zone of riparian vegetation. And again, I'm going to be using bank height as a metric for channel incision. So I'm interested in how these two impacts of urbanization might interact to affect riparian vegetation. And I expect that these summer flows are going to have more of an impact at low levels of incision than they do at high levels of incision. So I sampled sites in the urban matrix that varied by their level of channel incision and whether or not they received summer flow subsidies. And I'm just going to share one small part of this research today. So I wanted to see whether riparian trees were actually making use of these summer flow subsidies and whether channel incision affected their levels of water stress. So I chose valley oaks as a study species, and I looked at their water stress by taking readings of their water potential at midday on 48 trees during 2 summers. And in fact, I did see an interaction between flows and channel incision. So this graph shows bank height on the x-axis here, and then on the y-axis we have water potential, which is our measure of water stress. And you can see at low levels of incision, trees are much less stressed when there's stream flow, but at high levels of incision, it doesn't really make much of a difference. So we do see that these two factors associated with urbanization are interacting to affect water stress in riparian trees. And I also have preliminary evidence that they're affecting the composition of the riparian vegetation community as a whole. And so these differences are going to affect the carbon storage potential and habitat value of the riparian zones and influence aquatic ecosystems by affecting the timing, quantity, and quality of organic matter inputs. So to wrap up, what have we learned about how plant-soil-water interactions relate to ecosystem services in these highly altered small waterways, and how can it help us to inform management? First, we see that these small streams that once provided similar habitat across the entire valley are now structurally and compositionally distinct, and these differences are driven by land use. Interestingly, though, we did find similar levels of native wetland species in urban and agricultural stream margin ground layers, and this could be important for supporting wetland specialist species. We also have evidence from the agricultural system that riparian bank conditions do affect water quality and aquatic habitat by influencing nitrogen uptake, and that's related to levels of soil organic matter. And finally, we looked at these systems for carbon storage, and we see a huge potential for that in the urban system with that increase in riparian tree canopy. And both systems have similar potentials for storage and soil organic matter, and we saw that that was linked to riparian bank conditions that can be influenced by management.
All right, so let's bring this all together. What does it mean about management implications? First of all, it seems that less management might be beneficial to streams in the ag system. Lower management pressure was linked to more vegetation, which was then linked to soil and water quality, whereas in urban, we might actually need more management. We saw, for instance, that when you get into really closed canopy sites, you have decreases of native cover and diversity and more weeds. It's also important, we want people to be investigating both passive and active restoration techniques to reduce slopes at stream margins to convey some of these services. That's a really important zone for these things. And in urban streams, it's additionally important to mitigate incision. Finally, those dry season flows that we saw introduced in both of our systems seem to actually promote some of the services we want out of these systems, and that's something that we should continue to investigate, especially as irrigation practices continue to evolve in both landscapes. And overall, working in these highly impacted systems demonstrated to us that they're potentially really ecologically important and interesting. First of all, they're ubiquitous. Once you start seeing them around and wondering what they're doing, you can't stop. And second, they do a lot. They move a lot of water around. They have a lot of vegetation on them that's distinct from the surrounding uplands, and they respond to management pressures. That all makes them really interesting scientifically, and also highlighted to us how important it might be to integrate them into our understanding of freshwater and riparian ecosystems in California. And with that, we'll say thank you, and would love to talk to you after the break, and thank all of our interns and lab mates who help with this work, and of course our funding and partners, especially all the private landowners who let me come sample their water. Thank you.